Begin with breaking news that will test your faith in accidents and coincidences. On a day when former FBI Director Andy McCabe's new book was previewed in excerpts from 60 Minutes, ones that incensed the president to a degree that he tweeted multiple times and had his press secretary issue a vitriolic statement. On a day when a judge in the Paul Manafort case ruled that, as the special counsel's office contended, Paul Manafort intentionally lied while he was under a cooperation agreement with the special counsel's office. On a day when those stories would have led this newscast, the president has punked the nation, taking the news cycle hostage. White House announcing that the president will declare a national emergency to fund his wall, the wall Congress would not agree to fund in the bipartisan deal they reached to avoid a government shutdown. Trump will also sign that funding bill, one he said this week makes him sad, one he's not happy about. Joining us, Peter Baker. Peter, let me read your lead story in the New York Times. You're the chief White House correspondent. You write, President Trump plans to declare a national emergency so he can bypass Congress and build his long-promised wall along the border, even as he signs a spending bill that does not fund it. The move would effectively end a 2-month war of attrition between the president and Congress that closed much of the federal government for 35 days and left it facing a second shutdown as early as Friday. But it could instigate a new constitutional clash over who controls the federal purse. Peter?
Yeah, this is a big move by the president. One, I think he had telegraphed in recent days. He's overriding objections, not just from Democrats. Nancy Pelosi has already said this is an end run around Congress, but also from Republicans like Mitch McConnell, who personally went to the White House a few days back to warn the president against exactly this kind of move. Even conservatives who support the president on the border wall are worried that the idea of declaring a national emergency will set a precedent that will allow a future liberal president to do similar things, bypassing Congress on issues like climate change or gun control or other issues that Republicans, care about as well. So this is a big decision by this president, is one that probably will end up in the courts at some point.
Peter Baker, this is a president who has been in close contact with his allies on Fox News, Sean Hannity, and I caught some of Sean Hannity's program last night. Sean Hannity either not in the loop or this decision another example of Donald Trump's White House flailing in full view. Any reporting on when this decision came into formation and ready to announce?
Well, he just got the bill at the end of last night. The White House did. They were studying it's more than 1,000 pages, and they were very concerned about what they call landmines in the bill. There are provisions in there the White House really doesn't like. For instance, giving local governments a lot more of a say, basically, on this border, any border fencing, any kind of barrier put up along the border. The White House was very, very upset about that. And there had been some concern that on the part of people who wanted him to sign it that he wouldn't do it, that he was going to try to find some other way to keep the government open through a continuing resolution while fighting this out even longer. But clearly, Mitch McConnell, who announced this decision by the president on the Senate floor, was pushing the president into making a decision, announcing it before the vote so that he could lock in, a favorable vote by his Republican caucus. He didn't want his Republicans caught out voting for a bill the president wasn't going to sign.
Peter Baker, you and your colleagues did some extraordinary reporting around the last shutdown, and it ended when more Republicans signed on to the Democratic bill than were enthusiastic about the Republican bill, which included border funding. Is the White House sort of woken up to the reality that when it comes to funding the border wall, they've lost the battle over the hearts and minds of the Republican caucus, at least in the Senate?
Well, they're very frustrated with their Republican allies. The president is, obviously. He's expressed that in recent days. He's taken some of his ire out on Paul Ryan, who's no longer there. He was the House Speaker, of course, until the beginning of this year. But he blames Paul Ryan for promising him to get money for the wall and then not delivering, in effect, last year when the Republicans still controlled the House. Now, of course, the House is in the control of Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats. So the idea that they were going to do something that Paul Ryan's Republicans weren't willing to do was always sort of a it's kind of a stretch. So, yeah, I think he's frustrated with Republicans as much as he's angry at the Democrats at this point.
And what is the case that will be articulated in an emergency declaration when the flow of illegal immigrants over the border wall is at a 40-year low?
Yeah, it's a good question because, in fact, of course, if it's an emergency now, why wasn't it an emergency 5 years ago or 10 years ago? The numbers don't support the idea that there's something extraordinary happening now that hasn't happened in the past. On the other hand, there is a law passed by Congress back in the 70s, the National Emergencies Act, that does give presidents the ability to declare these, emergencies in some circumstances. There are currently 31 national emergencies still in operation declared by this president or his predecessors. So it's not an unusual thing in that sense. What's unusual is using this legislation to move money around the way he's planning to do. Most of these national emergency declarations are about, freezing property of people from, dictatorial countries that are in the middle of a bad war, or that kind of thing. Sanctions, in effect. This is unusual in the fact that he's trying to win through a national emergency declaration where he could not win through a policy fight with Congress. And that'll be the argument that goes to the courts. Can he do something on his own authority that Congress basically told him no, they wouldn't authorize?
And what is the legal argument? I imagine the White House counsel's office has been background briefing reporters and laying out the legal case, because I think there's some real questions. I worked in a White House for 6 years. I'm not sure what authority a White House has for appropriating funds for a border wall.
Yeah, there is an argument. We've interviewed in the past legal experts who say there's a plausible case, an arguable case anyway, that a president can do this under the legislation that's currently on the books. But it's not a slam dunk, and it definitely is something that a lot of other experts say is subject to challenge. It'll depend on which judges take a look, and if it gets to the Supreme Court, of course, right now there's a 5-4 split among conservative appointees and liberal appointees. If it comes to that, it's possible he could get authorization for it. We don't know. It's too early to say. But they have been looking at this. They have been studying this. We don't know if there's a Justice Department, OLC, Office of Legal Counsel opinion about it or not. But the White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders came out a few minutes ago and talked to reporters in the briefing room and told them that they're prepared for any legal challenge that might be instituted against it.
Never the sign of a good rollout. We're prepared for the court fight. Thank you, Peter Baker. We'll keep an eye on your feed. Come back in the next 55 minutes if you have anything new. Joining our conversation from the Washington Post, senior political reporter Aaron Blake. With us at the table today, Chuck Rosenberg, a former U.S. attorney who worked on the staffs of both Robert Mueller and James Comey at the FBI. Rick Stengelsbach, former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy. Nick Confessori, political reporter at the New York Times. And Karine Jean-Pierre is here, senior advisor to MoveOn.org. I have to start with you because I feel like when I feel the pangs of what used to be, you feel them as intensely as I do. If you wanted a border wall and you were the president of the United States, it would be your prerogative to go build support among your own party, and then to get that support to transfer to members of Congress in the House and Senate who would support legislation funding a wall. He failed on that front. He's failing all day, every day in full view. And now on a day when there are two stories that we know he loathes, and more than loathes, fears, he does this. What do you think? Just a coincidence, Nicole, right?
So here's the thing about the shutdown that we just endured. That was 35 days of utter fecklessness. I mean, you put people in great financial jeopardy. It's upsetting. It's demoralizing. It makes our government inefficient. And occasionally it is inefficient on its own. It doesn't always need help. But it's a terrible disservice to the folks who work in the United States government and the citizens they serve. And now he's going to declare a national emergency. There's some legislative support for that. There's some,
There's tolerance for it. Mitch McConnell's actually warned him against doing this.
There's tolerance for it. That's a better word. But it's not clear to me that he's going to win this legal fight because appropriations are manifestly, the province of the Congress. And he's taking that from them. And so...
Yeah, but wait, I don't want to gloss over that because Peter Baker talked about, if it ends up, and you've got a really bad case if you're banking on the 5-4 breakdown in the Supreme Court on the day you announce the policy. But the law is pretty clear. The appropriators are not at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, they're at the other end.
No.
You learned that like on Sesame Street or PBS.
It's Article 1 of the Constitution. The appropriating powers are vested in the Congress of the United States. And so this should not be a political issue on the Hill. Republicans and Democrats ought to think carefully about what the Constitution says about their authority and how they feel about any president usurping that.
Rick Stengel, this also, and you were a magazine editor, if you were going to put a story on the front page, if you were going to put Andy McCabe's face on the front page, And if you woke up as a White House having to deal with the president's booming rage and vitriolic tweets about Andy McCabe, if you read this morning's newspaper analysis about the ruling in the Manafort case, and you have more evidence that a judge, an impartial judge, is siding with the kinds of arguments being made by Andrew Weissman, the lead prosecutor in the Mueller case. You've got a president out of his mind being called a weenie by Ann Coulter. What do you do? What do you do if Ann Coulter thinks you're a weenie? You would declare a national emergency. What would you put on the front page? The national emergency, Andy McCabe, or Manafort?
No, the national emergency, I think, because it's a true constitutional issue.
He punks the country and we fall for it.
Because remember, the Constitution originally said that Congress has the power to declare an emergency. In the 1976 National Emergencies Act, Congress ceded that to the president. Since 1976, presidents have declared 31 emergencies, which Congress has actually never done anything about. The bill says Congress every 6 months has to review a national emergency, and they haven't. They haven't done it once. So what this is all about, I think, and we may see a positive result, is Congress having its own power threatened by a unilateral abuse of power by the president to do something which Congress doesn't really want him to do. The courts really don't have that much say about the president declaring a national emergency. That legislation gave the president extraordinary powers. But Congress, looking at the usurpation of its own power, could say, you know what, Mr. President, this is not a real emergency. It's not an emergency by any definition, and we are going to annul what your declaration of national emergency says.
So I don't want to gloss over this either. You're all blowing my mind here. So you think this is an example of abuse of power? I mean, we talk about him praising autocrats. We talk about the lurches toward autocratic tropes and attacks on the press and whatnot. But you think this is actually using his executive powers in a way that's
Yes, I think it's potentially a clear abuse of power.
Wow.
If you look at this legislation, even autocratic countries have a more circumscribed declaration of emergency by a president than the 1976 Act does.
Yeah.
And Congress can change it and amend it, and Congress in real time can nullify his declaration of an emergency.
So no one's ever accused me of leading with the substance, but let's get to the substance here at 412. The substance of this is a loser, too. I mean, in a normal White House, and I'm going to stop, like maybe at year 3, comparing him to a normal White House, but a normal White House would say that because of my language on immigration, illegal immigration is at a 40-year low, and I am proud of that. And you'd put it on your marketing materials, you'd squeeze it on the back of a MAGA hat or whatever the heck they do, and you'd run on it. Only Donald Trump would lie about a success story to build a fake wall with money that isn't his.
But his tool here is fear, right, as a politician. It's how he won election in the first place. It was his go-to in 2018 where it failed. But you know, a basic tool in the toolkit is to find an other and find a way to keep the fear going and stir people up. In this case, though, this act here is a giant punt, and Senator McConnell is holding the football and President Trump is kicking. It's a way of taking this problem away from the Senate and away from the GOP and putting it over there in the courts. So it's someone else's problem. Unfortunately, in the process, it may create a huge constitutional crisis. If Congress hasn't got the power of the purse, it doesn't have power.
You and I watched Nancy Pelosi before the show. I want to show that to our viewers, and we'll talk about it on the other side.
You want to talk about a national emergency? Let's talk about today, the one-year anniversary of another manifestation of the epidemic of gun violence in America. That's a national emergency. Why don't you declare that emergency, Mr. President? I wish you would. I know the Republicans have some unease about it, no matter what they say, because if the president can declare an emergency on something that he has created as an emergency, an illusion that he wants to convey, just think of what a president with different values can present to the American people.
She's right.
Yeah, he's setting a bad precedent by doing this, right? We heard from Republicans for the past, 2 weeks while this was going on, after the shutdown, after they reopened the government, was that if Donald Trump were to do this, what happens when a Democratic president is there and they do a national emergency, maybe for climate change? He is setting a bad precedent, and Republicans know that. With Mitch McConnell standing there on the floor of the Senate saying, hey, you know what, I support this, when we we know he doesn't, when we know he does not want this to happen. And what he's doing is he's handing over the keys to the president. It is a co-equal branch of government, Congress is. And it is just shameful. There is no national emergency, at least not with this border wall that we all know from expert is a failed policy. It is a humanitarian crisis, what we're seeing at the border, but not a national emergency. It's shameful, it's abuse of power, and it's blatantly unconstitutional.
Aaron Blake, can you jump in on the two threads of what we're grappling with here in the 4 p.m. hour? Sort of the headlines this White House woke up to, their known aversion to acknowledging any victories in the courtroom for the Mueller prosecutors, which yesterday was a clear one in the Manafort case. The president's public feud with Andy McCabe, and I know the spin is, oh, it's a good fight for him. This is not a good fight for him. This is a man that the vast majority of Americans will view as a public servant who got his wires crossed with the president and is now telling his story after paying the ultimate price, losing his job, having his wife slandered, and now facing more legal problems. The president also with his back up against the wall, being called a weenie by Ann Coulter and other right-wing nuts. What do you make of the move today?
Well, what we're seeing is an escape hatch. I think one of the guests referred to it as a punt. This is also an escape hatch for everybody involved. We haven't seen reporting on exactly what the conversations between Mitch McConnell and the president have been, but I wouldn't be surprised if McConnell basically assented to him on this national emergency after advising him against it because it was a way to bring this entire thing to an end. Look, this is how the president has conducted himself throughout his presidency. He is willing to go farther than anybody else as far as digging his feet in. He is willing to do things as far as breaking down political norms that we haven't seen in politics in decades, maybe even ever. And that puts other people around him in the position of basically either tolerating him or drawing a line in the sand and actually fighting him on something. And there is not a desire to fight him on this. This is a way for McConnell to get past a shutdown that he apparently never wanted in the first place and was threatening to happen again. And so basically he can throw this to the courts and they can decide what's going to happen now. But the unintended consequences of that, I think, are bigger than a lot of people realize. This is something that is not tested in the courts. This is something that could very well succeed. A president could use a national emergency declaration to get something like this done, which is basically a political promise that he made with no real argument for the national emergency having increased in recent years. And if that, there's a reason we haven't had this fight before, and it's because legislators stood up to the presidency because they wanted to have that fight, because they wanted to protect their prerogatives. They're just not in a mood to fight with the president. At least Republicans aren't right now. And so we are seeing things tested in a way that they simply have never been tested before.
I think Aaron Blake is absolutely right. And I wonder all the time if this White House ever knows what's around the corner. They seem to get lost in the crises, not of the day, but of the hour. And what's around the corner for them, and I know this, having worked in a Republican White House that lost the Republicans at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue over policy, not over tact. This is over tactics and policy, is that they have no idea what the next few weeks and months are about to be like, because being at war with Nancy Pelosi will feel like a walk in the park compared to the subversive, quiet, silent sneak attacks from Senate Republicans. I mean, Nancy Pelosi is a master tactician, a master strategist, and a brilliant public sort of leader and general of her troops. Mitch McConnell is sort of plays cloak and dagger, and this White House will not see his attacks coming.
I think that's right, Nicole. Here's what's interesting. The opening of your show, I think, said it well. There was an earlier crisis today. There were two bad news stories, and suddenly we're talking about something else. So there doesn't.
We're not.
Well, we're not, but others might be. But there doesn't seem to be long-range vision or long-range planning. But there does seem to be an ability, maybe unintentional, maybe intentional, to change the topic. Here's the problem with this one in terms of long-term planning. They might win in the court. They might lose in the court. The courts typically have deferred to presidents when they declared national emergencies. Courts are loath to second-guess presidents on foreign policy or national security matters. This is not quite that. So I think there's an opening for the president to lose, and I think he probably should on this one. But if something goes wrong for this president, he simply diverts attention to some other invented crisis.
And it's almost like a new tell. I mean, for a while, we have the tweets. He tweets, I don't care about this, but then on the 8th tweet, you realize that he cares deeply about whatever the attack is. You've got now another tell that he's sort of lost the room, if you will.
How long can you continue to proclaim that you don't care about something, right?
Right.
I mean, you're right. After the 30th tweet, maybe he does care. But on this thing, he lost in the form that our founding fathers created to adjudicate this very question. It was never intended for the courts. Now, Rick's right. There is legislation that permits presidents to declare national emergencies.
Sure.
But you'd think it should be a national emergency if they're going to do that.
or at least not a 30-year low of something that once was an emergency.
The theme of your show is, and has been for a long time, is that there are norms and red lines in American life, and he is violating all of them in every different way. And we don't actually have laws and legislation to prevent that. Because the National Emergencies Act presumes a president is actually acting in the national interest. We have a president who is acting in malign interest. Legislation has to compensate for that. All of these norms that we all used when in government, he doesn't care. He walks all over. There needs to be legislation and laws to protect those things that need protecting.